I think the data makes it extremely clear that one, the grid isn't cleaning up as quickly as people expect. We're making good progress. I think that's actually going to be eradicated as our energy demands go up and utilities do scramble to bring more power online more quickly. We talked about in previous episodes how this is not a quick fix because you've got 5 to 10 to 15 year development cycles to be able to permit, design, construct, bring new facilities online. So we're kind of stuck with what we've got, and we've got a real great opportunity in a period in time to actually proactively get on the front foot and really take ownership. One of the big statements we often hear from our customers is that the grid is getting greener and cleaner. And so why can't I just wait for my utility to clean up my energy supply? And therefore, I actually don't have to do anything to hit my sustainability targets. That's what we're going to dig into today, Dan. Excited for it. Before we do, we'd love to hear what you've been up to on a personal level.
Certainly, Gareth. It's good to be back. I had an awesome weekend, as we like to call it in my house, boys' weekend, where my wife was actually out of town on business for the weekend. Shout out to her. She was supporting a large group of runners at the New York Marathon. But so that meant that me and my two toddler boys got to spend the weekend together, going to soccer, going to t-ball, going to the beach. Had some friends over, and it was just an awesome time to bond with them, focus my time and attention on them. It is exhausting, but at the same time, extremely fulfilling. So you know how much I like when I get my one-on-one time with them. But good to have my wife back. She made it back safe this afternoon, and yeah, it's good. It's good time with the boys and spending time with family. How about yourself, Gary?
That's great. I actually saw clips of some people running in the marathon. It looked massive, mega, and I bet the atmosphere was absolutely incredible. Um, for me, it was I really enjoyed the F1 this weekend. Brazil, crazy wet weather, threw a lot of spanners in the works, created a bit of a unexpected weekend. Big shout out to Alpine for getting second and third. I think Verstappen always manages to figure it out. So love his love his ability to, through any scenario, actually just adapt on the fly and get it done. But other than that, getting ready for a few weeks on the road. So for anyone on the East Coast, New York, Detroit, Atlanta, who wants to hang out, the next month I'm going to be mostly out there. So please hit me up. But Dan, let's dive in. So grid's getting cleaner. Why do we have to do anything? I think this is it sounds super logical. You know, the utilities are speaking about this a lot, how they're working really hard to decarbonize our grid, and they're on a great trajectory. And so why would we spend time and effort building our own on-site energy systems to reduce our emissions? And I think this sounds it does sound logical, but I think the reality is when we're in that steady state of energy supply or energy demand, the utilities could match it with supply and they could slowly chip away at starting to decarbonize that supply. I think particularly right now, as we're seeing demand really ramping back up again, we're seeing some trends around energy carbon intensity also ramping with that as utilities scramble to meet that demand. Some of the easiest ways to do that are through ramping up the traditional fossil powered generating assets because they already exist. We can turn them back on, we can ramp them up, get them working full steam. And a lot of the benefits that have been achieved over the last few years are now being eroded again. So much so that we're seeing some of the big tech guys actually even starting to consider nuclear. And I think that's going to be another exciting episode in the future, exploring their attempts to decarbonize with reliable power. But we'd love to. We've taken some of the data down over the last few years from the EIA and we've sliced and diced it across the country in terms of rates, carbon intensity, as well as emission reductions. What are some of the trends that really stand out for you?
Yeah, as we were preparing for this, what spurred the conversation was looking at the change in rates from 2022 to 2024, and then I said, well, let's start to lay that over what the grid carbon intensity is and how that's changed over the past many years. And so, I mean, overarchingly, the good news is most states, when you look at a state by state level, have reduced their carbon intensity or the grids in those states have reduced in carbon intensity. The best, or the one that has reduced the most from 2018 to 2022, and that's the most recent data available from the EIA, was actually Iowa, followed by South Dakota. And that was they reduced their carbon intensity by 33 and 31.8% respectively. And that's not really a shocker, because that is really the wind belt of the U.S. and there's been a massive amount of wind deployment in those areas. But then when we go to the opposite end of the spectrum, this is where I was actually rather surprised that, again, over that time period, over that 5-year time period, there were 8 states that actually increased in carbon intensity. And the worst of which being Idaho, that increased 44% in carbon intensity. And then followed by Vermont, but I'll give Vermont a pass since their carbon emissions are as close to zero as they possibly could. They're only sitting at about 6 kilograms of CO2 per megawatt hour of generation, and when you compare that to some of the worst offenders that are in the 800 plus kilograms per megawatt hour of generation, Vermont does get a bit of a pass. But then when you start to look at the others that are sitting there towards the top that have actually increased emissions over that time period, some of the ones that jumped out at me were the ones that are up in New England. So Vermont, Massachusetts, Maine, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and even New York all saw increases in their carbon intensity. And the reason that those in particular jumped out at me is because those are often the states that have the most expensive rates. In fact, when we look at 2024 state by state rates, according to the EIA, 6 of the top 11 most expensive states saw this increase, which was pretty staggering to me. And so, what that made me think about is the companies that we talk to that say, "Oh, I'm just going to let the grid get greener." And one would think that these maybe more progressive, more democratic, especially as we're in this election cycle, states would be the ones that are decarbonizing the most, and they're going to be the shining examples of grid decarbonization. Yet they're actually getting more carbon intensive, and so we then bring that to what actually gets projects moving forward, Gareth. It's carbon. It's the economics of
Yeah,
projects,
always.
and so then we start to look at where were the states that had the greatest change over since 2020 in their energy charges. And worst offender right here in our own backyard, California. When you adjust for inflation, which over 2020 to 2024, inflation was roughly 21.5%. Even after adjusting for inflation, California commercial rates went up 41%. Like,
Yeah.
how we continue to conduct business here is crazy, but at the same time, that's just all the more reason that we see on-site energy systems going in here in California. But
Yeah.
then you see New York and Maine increasing 15 and 10%. And so it starts to paint this picture that if you're a business that's trying to decarbonize, on-site energy is a phenomenal pathway for doing so. What were some of the things that stood out for you most, Gareth?
Yeah, I think the raw change in rates absolutely blows my mind. California 70%, New York 40, Maine 35, Massachusetts 30, and I think we're seeing a lot of activity in those states for those very reasons. Not only are the rates skyrocketing, they also have massive opportunity to reduce carbon intensity for businesses with large portfolios of sites. Like we've talked about in the past, not all sites are created equal, and so we wouldn't want to start developing on-site systems in the likes of Washington State, because there we see some of the lowest carbon intensity because a lot of the grid is hydropowered, and it's also as a result super cheap. And so when you're trying to design a system to compete on economic merit and gain additional business benefits, it's very hard to make it work there. But in those states we've talked about, there's just huge opportunities to get double and triple wins. And very often these states are also impacted by, in the Northeast, cold weather events, storms. And so we're increasingly seeing resilience being an issue. We talked on the last episode about regulations. You mentioned kind of the blue leaning states. We're seeing some more regulations, more penalties there. So you start stacking these things up, and I think the data makes it extremely clear that one, the grid isn't cleaning up as quickly as people expect. We're making good progress. I think that's actually going to be eradicated as our energy demands go up and utilities do scramble to bring more power online more quickly. We talked about in previous episodes how this is not a quick fix because you've got 5 to 10 to 15-year development cycles to be able to permit, design, construct, bring new facilities online. So we're kind of stuck with what we've got, and we've got a real great opportunity in a period in time to actually proactively get on the front foot and really take ownership. Um, Dan, anything else that stands out for you?
I think the other thing, as we think through it, when we're working with businesses that have dozens or hundreds or in some cases thousands of sites, one of the biggest pieces is to figure out where they're going to have, quote, the biggest bang for their buck. So where are they
Yeah,
going to be able to decarbonize the most and have the strongest economic impact? And when you look at the cheapest states, states like when we look at 2024 commercial rates, North Dakota, Nebraska, Utah, Wyoming, Idaho, these are states where the rates are sub 10 cents per kilowatt hour. And they are some of the more carbon intensive states. Wyoming, for example, 833 kilograms of CO2 per megawatt hour of generation. It's one of the highest across the entire country. But you're not going to have a great financial business case for deploying an on-site energy system there. And in all my time doing this, anytime once the rubber meets the road and the capital allocation committee gets pulled in or a CFO gets consulted on whether or not they'd approve a spend or signing a long-term PPA, it all comes back to what's the payback, what's the IRR, what is this really going to mean for us in dollars and cents. And so I think as we look at where to deploy these systems, again, it really jumped out at me that there was quite a few of the higher cost states that had these jumps in carbon intensity. So I think you can start to build this case, especially as, to your point, demand for electricity continues to increase, and we're going to see. I'm eager to see the 2023 and soon the 2024 data from EIA on emissions, to see if this trend of rising emissions rather than lowering emissions on the grid continues. It's going to force folks to look at opportunities to take matters into their own hands, not be subject to just buying a bunch of renewable energy certificates or offsets, or be subject to the indexing that happens with virtual power purchase agreements. Like you said, the state that always kind of jumps out as cheapest and cleanest is Washington. So if you have an opportunity to build up there, great. If you don't, there's a lot of other factors that come into this. And I think when you're looking across a whole portfolio, these are just two factors: rates
yeah,
and carbon intensity. But then when you start to layer on regulations, incentives, renewable potential, demand charges, these all start to come in. And so being able to account for all of these in a real time manner is going to be important to maximize the opportunity ahead of you.
yeah. I think we often see this, don't we, Dan? Is there's lots of misconceptions, there's lots of preconceived ideas, and we often see um, our customers in the industry coming into the process of thinking about on-site energy with a gut instinct of what they should do and where they should do it. And the statement we started this podcast is often one, but another is, I'm just going to start where I've got my biggest carbon emitting facilities. And as we've talked about, that also may not make the most economic sense because it may be that rates are super cheap. It may be that outage risks are super low. It may be that incentives are not as good. And so, in terms of real return on investment, you have to be able to weigh all these variables alongside each other and then make a really informed decision. And I think some of the things that often catch people out, we often think Colorado, surely it must be a clean state, super progressive, and lots of renewables potential. We often see people being really surprised that you can actually install a gas turbine at your facility in Colorado and still reduce your emissions because it's still heavily coal fired and it's got a fairly high carbon intensity. And so these are consistent themes that we see in the market, and we want people to just take a step back, remove the emotion, remove the preconceived ideas, let the data speak for itself, and then let's show you through data how to socialize that in your organization to get people really well educated, informed, and excited about making these decisions, because the upside when you get it right is awesome.
It makes me think of a previous episode when we sat down with Mike Dietrich, and I believe his quote was, "You got to learn to work from within the system." And
Yeah.
so, rather than just selecting the highest emitters, where are the strongest business cases? Because business is business, and if we work within the system, then we're going to achieve the overall goals. And so that's, I think, a really important thing to keep in mind. So I'd say, in summary, again, I'll come back to the fact that when we look at 2024 energy charge numbers, the top 10 most expensive states plus the District of Columbia. So when we look at those 11, 6 of those 11 saw an increase in carbon emissions intensity. And a couple others that were right there on that on the cusp were places like California. California, from 2018 to 2022, only saw a 2% reduction in carbon intensity, which is pretty crazy. I actually did not know that. I thought it was going to be much more profound than that. So I think the important thing, focus on where you can have the biggest bang for your buck. That'll get projects done. That'll get contracts signed and capital allocation committees moving forward on these things. But remember that just putting matters into others' hands and saying, "Oh, the utilities are going to clean up," even with them having big, large integrated resource plans and decarbonization strategies, that all goes out the window when you have massive, growing amounts of demand that are on the grid. So this has been a good one. It's been eye-opening for me as we were digging into the data and preparing, and certainly look forward to supporting anybody that's going on this journey and wants to find where the best places are to build, and what the best systems are to build at those locations, and who the best partners are to partner with to build those systems.
Love the research. Thanks for sharing, Dan.
See ya.
We receive a lot of questions from business leaders around the world wanting to learn more about the energy transition, what is possible, and where to start. So to help you stay informed and up to date on best practices, opportunities, risks, and success stories, we created an industry newsfeed at VECKTA.com/news with all our podcasts, blogs, and newsletter. Check it out and connect with Dan, myself, and the VECKTA team to learn more. Cheers and have a good one.